Welcome once again. We are here in Living in the 21st Century. Today's a special guest, John Robbins, and that's Dr. John Robbins. He's from the Council of Islamic Relations in Massachusetts. John, I want to thank you for being here today, and we hope we can shed some serious light on as to what's going on in the Muslim world, especially here in America.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So tell us, John, a little bit about CARE, which is the Council on Islamic Relations in Massachusetts.
Sure. So CARE is the largest Muslim advocacy and civil rights group in the U.S. For over 20 years, we've been defending the rights of Muslim Americans, much like the ACLU defends civil rights and civil liberties. We have a focus particularly on Muslim Americans. And so, for example, that might look like recently in Colorado, where 200 Somali American Muslims were laid off over a prayer dispute involving scheduled prayer breaks.
Yes.
And we've provided them with an attorney, and we're currently going to court for them. To even something much more everyday, such as in Massachusetts, when a woman might be fired because of her religious garb or religious attire. We're providing those services. And in relation to that, we're also doing media work, and we're working to challenge Islamophobia.
Beautiful. Recently, there was somewhat an attack from political members, especially Donald Trump in this case, which he had said news statements like bombing the shite out of Muslims. He wants Muslims out of America until the government can figure out what the hell is going on. I think that this is serious remarks coming from someone who are looking potentially to become a leader in the United States of America. This doesn't only affect Muslims as a minority in this country, but there are several other minorities in this country who are faced with this kind of vicious psychological attacks on minorities. And I want to find out from you, how are Muslims today coping with this kind of dangerous psychological threat, so to speak?
Well, unfortunately, it is a challenging time in a lot of ways. When you have mainstream political figures espousing this kind of rhetoric, it legitimizes something that had previously been on the margins. So while you're obviously never going to be able to stop all people who are bigoted from espousing their narratives, when you have people who are public figures in this way, it gives a sense that this is somehow a legitimate view, or one that your everyday person can espouse without pushback. And this is particularly dangerous because it enables attacks on Muslims. It enables widespread discrimination institutionally. It enables all these negative things. So in response to this, Muslim Americans have been given a choice, basically, that they can either retreat and turn inward and go into the mosque and into the home and just privatize their Muslim identity, or they can become truly incorporated into the American fabric even more strongly than they were before, as a way of saying we will not be reduced, we will not be diminished, but we are going to stand up and be strong and show that we are truly Americans as much as Jewish Americans, Catholic Americans, Asian Americans, Latino Americans, Japanese Americans, any other group that has faced discrimination or harassment in the past.
Absolutely. Matter of fact, I heard Glenn Beck, who is a hardcore right-wing Republican, and he has said, it's like a couple of days ago actually, that should Donald Trump continue along this path, and he should become the nominee, he already foresee that there will be a uprising in this country, not only by Muslims, but by any other minority race, because it seems to be this issue with immigrants coming to this country. And what he doesn't recognize is that immigrants had came to this country and birthed natural Americans, birthed Americans in this country, who have all the legitimate rights as any other American, because they are Americans actually. And it puzzles me that there are some folks out there who may not be smart enough or intelligent enough to see this dividing and conquer shit. And I've seen it stretch all across the political atmosphere for many years, where the minorities are people, the average citizen who doesn't have time to really sit down and focus on on what's going on, to be misled by political figures and by stating the wrong things, when the actual fact is totally different. So this brings me to this other question. What are some of the great contributions that Muslims are actually making to the United States of America, especially those who are born here.
Mm-hmm. And you make a great point earlier as well, that it's not as though Muslims are somehow coming into the U.S. from far beyond. They've been here for generations,
Yes.
for centuries even. I mean, it's well documented that many of the African slaves who were brought over during the period of slavery in the U.S. were themselves Muslim, who had that identity pushed down or marginalized or scrubbed from them forcefully. And this is a terrible violence that was enacted upon them in addition to countless other violences. And Muslim Americans have been part of the fabric of this country ever since in a really vital way. So we have been, doctors, lawyers, engineers. We're pharmacists. We are building bridges and building roads. Approximately 10% of American doctors self-identify as Muslim. So even if people don't know that they've seen a Muslim or met one, likely they've met one in the medical field in a lot of ways. They're inventors. They're bringing in, they're job creators. They're very, very likely to start a small business or to be middle class and well educated. So these are individuals who are our neighbors, colleagues, and friends already. And it's just a matter of making people aware of this aspect of their identity that perhaps they've kept private for a long time.
Yes. And how would you best go about advising non-Americans to work cohesively with Muslims to fight this kind of prejudice that exists among us today? Because it just doesn't only affect Muslims. We in America exist as one entity, collectively speaking. And however you disenfranchise one group, it will have another impact on the other. How can we work collectively as a people and respectfully as a people to accomplish one common goal for the benefit of humanity? And that is to meet our basic needs every day without having to see each other as someone unusually different. How would you perceive going about to do something like that?
Well, there are a few ways. At the end of the day, bigotry is grounded in ignorance. It's not about hatred, it's about fear of the unknown. 65% of Americans say that they've never met a Muslim. And this is a huge number, and it's very easy to hate someone when you've never met them.
Exactly.
It's very hard when you have someone in a hug or a handshake.
That's right.
And so we believe very powerfully that Muslims have a responsibility to introduce themselves and be more inclusive within the broader society, and at the same time that broader society also has a responsibility to meet their Muslim neighbor, to go into a mosque and say, okay, what does it look like when Muslims pray? Who are these neighbors here? That in the same way as Muslim Americans should be, we believe very strongly, running for school boards, for city councils, for mayoral seats and elected positions there, sitting on PTAs and city governments, that at the same time people should be aware and say, well, okay, in the same way as, for instance, we say, well, we wouldn't want to have an all-male school board or an all-white school board. Maybe we should say, well, we want a not only gender inclusive and racially inclusive, but also religiously inclusive governing body here, and to make those active efforts. So I think the outreach really does need to go both ways, and that's a powerful way forward for us.
Okay. One thing I would love to ask you, and it may be a little bit out of your reach. Now, we know recently the President of the United States would have signed a nuclear agreement with Iran. And obviously, there are Jews who would believe that this is a slap in the face. Personally, I think it was a bad choice. Iran is somewhat unstable based on leadership. And we know of threats in the past years towards Israel. What do you think, what is your opinion on that? Allowing a place like Iran to have access to nuclear material and giving permission to UN to come in and inspect their premises. I mean, tomorrow you can wake up and a new leader take over and say, well, hey, you know what? That was the old leader agreement. It's not mine. To hell with that. It's out through the window. Do you perceive that Iran is really a serious threat to Israel?
So, I appreciate your asking about this, but our focus is really domestic at the end of the day. For care. Yeah, I appreciate it.
I just decided that's a question out the clear blue sky. So
no, and it's obviously an important thing that we need to be talking about as an issue, but we don't take a position on that simply because it's, we are really concerned about domestic treatment of U.S. Muslims.
Why do you think, though, the U.S. government would directly or indirectly initiate this kind of resentment towards Muslims as a whole?
You mean as an institutionally, that kind of thing?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Why would you think they do that? Do you think that it's some form of just hatred and use terrorism as a way to get it over? Use terrorism as a method of getting or targeting Muslims? What do you think in this case?
Well, unfortunately, U.S. policy domestically has for many years had a difficult track record when it comes to racial and religious minorities. This is not something that's new or specific toward the Muslim community, whether this is institutionalized internment camps of Japanese Americans during the 1940s and early 50s, whether this is discriminatory laws directed toward African Americans in the 60s and early 70s. Unfortunately, there have been far too many instances of governmental policies that are unfair or not inclusive as they should be. And we've seen this historically coming up time and time again. So when it comes to Muslim Americans, this is unfortunately, nothing particularly new. So we're really very concerned about how to target these as something that we can improve upon. How to make it so that, for instance, policies such as what's called countering violent extremism, which is a new government-led initiative, which basically amounts to targeted surveillance of Muslim communities in much the same way that you remember the NYPD did during the...
Exactly.
That kind of had this sphere of influence. So we oppose those kind of things. Yeah.
You know what is really strange, though? And I have to applaud the Muslims for this. And I'll tell you why. Despite of the drastic measures that will come towards the Muslim religion from anyone, be it government, anyone, I don't see, or I can't remember, ever seeing Muslims get up and protest. And I think it's their rights if they want to protest against this kind of treatment. Why would, you see blacks protest when they need to do it, and they do it pretty fast. Why would the Muslims not want to get up and protest, or even find ways of implementing policies to government to try to just keep these problems subdued from being exploded out of one space?
So protesting against things like surveillance or informants, that kind of thing. Yeah. So there have been some limited capacity things, certainly, and even some much larger ones in the last decade or so against these kind of policies. But by and large, the Muslim community has responded in a variety of ways. And they respond by writing about these things. They respond by gathering community around them. They enact legislative advocacy, that kind of thing. It can a lot of mosque leaders are put in the following situation where they feel as though if they push back against these kind of policies, they'll be viewed as having something to hide. And so this is really a catch-22 that they're put in a lot of the time, where they say, okay, well, if we invite people in, then it makes it seem as though we're, completely transparent and have nothing to hide, as they obviously do. But if they say, no, we're not going to have anyone come in and put up those walls, then they worry that it will create that appearance that they've got some kind of impropriety, even though the vast majority of the time they have nothing to hide. So the Muslim leaders are put in this position that they've been trying to navigate, and we as an organization try to assist them through that in the best way possible.
You just mentioned putting up these walls, and we heard recently again, and you recognize the quote in Donald Trump all the time. He wanted to build this humongous wall, probably 45, 55 feet. But this is going to cost the American government and our taxpayer money, hard-earned dollars, in the vicinity of something like 10, probably $15 billion. And it's observed that we live in a time where technology is so unique. To try to reinvent the tool by whether it's be bring back the Berlin Wall or the Great Wall of China, I don't see why America should be somewhat encapsulated in such restrictions with walls and so forth. I was speaking earlier to someone that I think what government should do, I think is a good thing, is to build micro-intelligence centers at strategic points around the border. What will it serve? Well, if the American corporation or businessman want to hire cheap labor as they come across the borders, they will make their request to these intelligence centers. If there are jobs available, the employer would come and collect these people as they're hired on the spot. Now, this encourages transparency, and it also encourages accountability. And I'm quite sure that you will spend at least 1/8 of that kind of money Donald Trump is talking about. For anyone who want to commit a crime, and this in just Muslim, anyone, because it only seems to me that if you wear a turban around your head and you commit a crime, they brand it as terrorism anyhow. And we saw recently last year a guy went into a church, gunned down several people, but he wasn't branded a terrorist. We know of the case of Tim McVeigh, who would have killed many Americans, but I don't think he got branded as a terrorist either. Is it get branded as a hate crime? So these things somewhat mess with the mentality of society. When you can only put one group of people within one frame because of how they look and marginalize, and then use institutionalized measures, because that's what the politicians does pretty well. It's to institutionalize situations that the average person are intelligent enough to understand what's going on. So having said all of that, what would be your advice as someone who's expert in this kind of matters? What would be your advice to the average American out there who don't really know anything about Muslim or the Muslim society? How would you educate that person to let them know that we as Muslims, just as genuine and sincere as the ordinary person or the ordinary American that they think they are, is? How would you deal?
Well, a variety of ways. So, as I said before, I think it's very important to have these kind of humanizing interactions with people. So interactions where you actually are going and meeting someone, talking with someone, having a cup of coffee with a Muslim neighbor. And one way of doing this is by going to your local mosque. Many of them have open house days. Many of them will simply have their doors open for Friday prayers. And you can go and just kind of see and talk to people. There are always going to be people at a gathering of hundreds who are going to be, warm and open and welcoming for you. And by going in there and having those kind of interactions and opening that door literally and metaphorically, you're going to have a much more real engagement with someone than you might get just by watching the news or just by reading some articles online. It's very easy to hate someone at a distance. It's very hard to hate them up close. And you might read 100 negative portrayals about Islam in articles that take things, that are misquoting things or taking things out of context. But if you actually know someone for a few years and then read something like that, then you'll say, well, I know that Islam really can't be like that because my neighbor Ahmed would never do that, or my neighbor Suzanne, that kind of thing. So these are very powerful humanizing moments.
Exactly. And I think too that it was alleged on several occasions by many people that in the Muslim extremist world, that they believe that Americans in general, even the American Muslims, so this is to let the Americans know that in just Americans as Americans, even the American Muslims, they are looked upon by same Muslim extremists as infidels because they reside here in America, and when they come to, or should the event that they go to attack America, they don't care who. If it's Muslims, you're getting hurt the same very way because they deem you as a part of the same culture. When in actual fact, you all are sincere as some Christians, and as I said before, they are Christians. And if you go back into history time, we would recognize that we had the Knight Templars, who were some of the most brutal killers, and if you want to call them terrorists, now you could call them terrorists, and they had execute. As a matter of fact, they would have made the Muslim terrorists today look like saints. And this is reality. No one really speak about it. But all in all, what I believe is that crime is crime. It doesn't matter how you take it and you can it or how you put it. Crime is crime. And whoever commit crime should pay the penalty for committing crimes. And I had said once on a program before, it may seem a little bit extreme, but sometimes difficult times and hard times calls for serious measures. I had said that I think anyone who committed an act of terrorism, anyone, And this is to not say Muslim, anyone, whether you're Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, don't matter what the case may be. I believe that, yes, the forgiveness is there for everyone. But at the same very time, if a person is going to deliberately take it upon themselves to just execute tens of thousands of people or hundreds of people for no reason, that same person should be executed within 24 hours without any kind of judgment. They shouldn't be going to court to be judged. What are you going to be judged for? You just kill people. What are you going to be tried for? Why should you take the innocent taxpayers' money and spend it on someone who just killed tens of people, maybe hundreds of people, out their own money? It doesn't logically make sense to me. And this is not being harsh in any form. Sometimes you have to deal with certain situations on a serious level. But I also believe that there's a form of forgiveness. I think we should love each other. We should embrace that love. And I think we should take preventative measures in terms of introducing into schools some form of nonviolent subjects that can be taught. The complications that will come about when a person kills another person because of the extreme views or ideologies about a specific thing or a specific religion. You can't hurt innocent people. Everyone are entitled to that right. And I think it's about time that all religions, whether it's Muslim, whether it's Christian, find a way of pressuring government. I know it's a freedom of speech and it's freedom to do this and freedom to do that. But there are some things that if you commit, it's going to put you in prison. And it has nothing to do with religion. If you kill, you go to jail. If you murder, you go to jail. If you steal, you go to jail. Why can't some kind of subjects of good conscience being exercised into schools? Teachers teach guidance. We need guidance counselors in schools that would teach these things. And it's not to subtract from students who they should serve, who they should worship, or nothing like that. But the respect of humanity, the respect of human lives, I think that is very important. And so, what would you have anything to say? Would you have anything to say about that in terms?
Sure. So there's a lot there, and I would just start out by saying, we advocate very strongly for the rule of law and its equal application to all people. Even we think that one of the most frequent arguments that we hear from these extremist groups is exactly that the U.S. does not defend Muslim rights in the same way as it does others. So we do predicate very strongly on the equal application of justice and the rule of law for all people, regardless of what kind of crime they've committed, that kind of thing, that it's our strongest argument as Americans against this kind of extremism, that we say, no, we are a fair and just society that will absolutely evaluate you, give you a fair trial, and give you the opportunity for witnesses and all things considered in that way. It's important for all Americans to know that, when you talk about extremism by Muslims, that this is something that, as you said, is condemned by 99.999% of the 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, and that this is something that all of the Muslim scholarly community, with, again, single-digit exceptions, have condemned in enormous length. I mean, in hundreds and thousands of page volumes, explaining in detail why this is not Islamic, why this kind of behavior absolutely cannot be done, cannot stand whatsoever. That American Muslims categorically, again, 99.999% condemn this without reservation, and I've never met in my life anyone who doesn't. In my interaction with tens of thousands of Muslims, I've never met one that has anything but utter abhorrence for this kind of action. And that in the U.S., as you say, media coverage tends to be myopic. It tends to only focus on, it tends to only label as acts of terrorism those which are committed by Muslims, and ignores things like Dylan Roof killing 9 people in an African American church in South Carolina. When in reality, white Americans are much more likely to commit acts of extremism than Muslim Americans. You're twice as likely in that way. And again, that acts of violent extremism committed by Muslim Americans are vanishingly small in number. So, for example, you're much more likely to be killed by a refrigerator than you are by somebody committing an act in the name of violent extremism of Islam. But yet, when a refrigerator falls on someone, you don't see it on the headlines worldwide within 24 hours. So these are the sort of media coverage differentials that you get. And in talking about education, we feel is very important in that way. We find that mosques are actually great incubators for moderate viewpoints, and that what is really missing is not, The mosques are not the place in which a lot of this inculcation of negative thing happens, but they're really a place of community and education of the youth.
Yes. Okay.
And just as churches have youth programs and synagogues have youth programs, so too mosque youth programs tend to be very positive areas for children to learn from people who are truly educated in the religion and practice moderation, show that it is a religion of peace,
Okay.
a religion that says that if you kill one person, it's as though you've killed all mankind.
Yes. Okay.
And that says that you have to treat everyone the same regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of whether they are Muslim, Christian, Jew, or people of no belief background. And really demonstrate this clearly for the youth. As you say, education is key.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. John Robbins, I want to thank you so much for coming here on Living in the 21st Century and shedding some light on the Muslim religion and giving really an insight that what people have perceived Muslims to be, they are not. So I want to say thank you so much. And to all those who are at home, I want to thank you for tuning in once again on Living in the 21st Century. Until then, have a nice night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.